everyone. So today I will be presenting a narrative analysis on the psychologist Ivan Pavlov. He's one of the most influential figures in behavioral psychology and physiology. Pavlov's work on his classical conditioning really revolutionized our understanding of behavior, and his life was shaped by both his personal milestones as well as significant world events that took place during his lifetime. Alright, so let's go ahead and dive right into his story. So first, I just wanted to do a quick introduction of Ivan Pavlov. He was born on September 26, 1849 in Ryazan, Russia. Over here, we can kind of see a map of where Ryazan is in Russia. It's very close to Moscow. Ivan Pavlov was actually the firstborn of a total 10 children from his parents. And Ivan Pavlov really did grow up in a very religious upbringing. He was the son of Peter Pavlov, who was a village Russian Orthodox priest. During his life, he was really influential, as I mentioned, in the fields of psychology and physiology. And he went on to get his MD in natural sciences and medicine. He's best known for classical conditioning. That's also popularly referred to as Pavlovian conditioning after him, where his groundbreaking work began around the studies of digestion in dogs, which led to the theory of conditioned reflexes. And I really think that Pavlov's unique background in physiology really allowed him to approach psychology with this scientific rigor that no one else was doing at this time, and really made his contributions both innovative and enduring. Before psychology was everything to do with the mind, and he really brought a scientific nuance and really was able to bridge some of the gaps between physiology and psychology. Fortunately, on September 27th, 1936, he died of double pneumonia, which is where it affects both of his lungs. However, still very long, lengthy life, especially for his time, and Ivan Pavlov certainly did get a lot accomplished during his lifetime as well. Onto the major theoretical contributions, I wanted to really highlight his most known work, which was on classical conditioning with dogs and bells as we know it. So prior to this, he was studying digestion in dogs. I think Pavlov in total had about 40 dogs that he was doing experiments on. But he noticed that the dogs would salivate not only when the food was presented to them, but also at just the sight of his lab assistant or the sound of their footsteps. And this observation led him to explore and think of the concepts of what are known as psychic secretions, which eventually evolved into this theory of classical or Pavlovian conditioning. And his background in physiology really allowed him to, approach this behavioral psychology in kind of this natural way, but it was also very uncommon and undiscovered at the time. So how he discovered it or was in the lab, right? So he noticed that they would salivate from an external factor. So this connected to his conditioning model, which you can see in the left-handed side. So first there's the dogs that are presented with an unconditioned stimulus, and that ignites an unconditioned response. So the unconditioned stimulus being the food, and that produces an unconditioned response, salivation in the dogs, right? So that's a natural trigger for them. This is before the conditioning. Another thing that he wanted to isolate was, before the conditioning, was a neutral response, so a bell. So without the food, the experimenter would ring the bell, the neutral response, and it would be shown that there's no response in the dog. So the dog does not see the food, they only hear the ringing of the bell, and they in turn do not trigger the salivation response that food does. All right, so during the conditioning model, we can see that when the dogs were being fed food, and the salivation would be naturally triggered, the unconditioned response. At the same time that they were being presented the food, they would ring the neutral response, the bell, for the dogs. And then throughout the conditioning process, it got to the point where, after the conditioning, so when there's no unconditioned stimulus, when there's no food, when the dogs hear just the ringing of the bell, it triggers the salivation response. And this was really influential for the time, because it basically proved his theory that, that there is behavioral psychology, right? And that we could essentially teach at least dogs to produce certain responses through this Pavlovian conditioning process. So yeah. For his major life milestones and their influences, Pavlov was very well educated, and a lot of his milestones was his education. In 1870, that's where he enrolled in the University of St. Petersburg. And I thought that this was a milestone because that's where he abandoned his theological studies and enrolled at the University of St. Petersburg to study chemistry and physiology. And this was an influence in his life because he was exposed to these different scientific trainings that were very rigorous. And they also shaped his experimental approach to his research that we saw. He also studied under prominent scientists at St. Petersburg, like Dmitry Mendeleev, who was the creator of the periodic table, as well as physiologist Elias von Sion, who inspired Pavlov's interest in physiology and the nervous system. That's where he ended up getting a degree in natural sciences in 1875. And in 1879, that's where he graduated with an MD from the Military Medical Academy in St. Petersburg. And I felt like this was a milestone in his life because Pavlov earned his medical degree, and this medical training that he received really deepened his understanding of the human body, and particularly the digestive system and the nervous system. And this knowledge became the basis for his later experiments on digestion in dogs that he would experiment with, which, eventually led to the discovery of his classical or Pavlovian conditioning. And then in 1881, that's where he was married to his wife, Serafima. And then they ended up having 4 children together that survived into adulthood. This was a really big milestone for him. Didn't have as many siblings as he grew up with, but definitely a family that he worked hard to keep. And then in 1890, that's when he was appointed professor at the Military Medical Academy that he got his MD from. And I felt like this was very big milestone for him because he became actually the director of the Department of Physiology at the Institute of Experimental Medicine. So this position really provided Pavlov with the resources and the facilities to conduct extensive research on digestion and physiology, and his experiments on dogs during this period really led to the discovery of psychic secretions that I mentioned, which later evolved into this theory of classical conditioning. And in 1879, that's where he published lectures on the work of the digestive glands. And I felt like this was a big milestone for Pavlov because that's where he published his seminal work on digestion, which really detailed his experiments on the digestive system of dogs. And this publication really established Pavlov as a leading figure in physiology and earned him international recognition, really. And his research on digestion laid the groundwork for his later work on conditioned reflexes, as he observed that, the dogs would not salivate not only on the sight of food, but also at the sight of his labia system or their first footsteps. And then, last but not least, I really wanted to include in 1904 that he was awarded the Nobel Prize of Physiology for his research on the digestive system. And obviously any Nobel Prize comes with very great honor, and this really brought Pavlov global acclaim and provided him with even more additional funding and resources to expand his research. And, this recognition allowed Pavlov to shift his focus from digestion to the study of conditioned reflexes, which obviously became his most significant contribution to psychology, especially behavioral psychology. All right, and then some of the world events that occurred during Pavlov's lifetime that I wanted to include, that's in red text. First being the emancipation of the serfs in Russia. I felt like this really did have a big impact on Pavlov, as, he was born into a deeply religious family in Ryazan, Russia, during the time of significant social change. And the emancipation of the serfs really marked the end of feudalism in Russia and led to increased social mobility as well. And I felt like this event likely influenced Pavlov's decision to pursue science rather than theology, which he abandoned, as we now know, as it opened up new opportunities for education and career advancements outside of the church. So, before he was the son to a priest, he was likely going to go into, theology and go into that field. But because of the emancipation, he was given the freedoms to pursue other passions. Right? And then in 1917 was the Russian Revolution. Obviously, the Russian Revolution brought political and economic instability, which actually disrupted Pavlov's research. And the funding for his scientific projects became scarce, and Pavlov faced challenges in maintaining his laboratory. And despite these difficulties, Pavlov's work gained recognition as the new Soviet government sought to promote science as a tool for societal progress. And Pavlov's research on conditional reflexes was seen as a way to understand and control human behavior, which, was aligning with the government's goals. I thought something important to note was that, he also really believed that behavior consists of inborn unconditioned reflexes, the stuff that we're born with, and conditioned reflexes that are constantly being reinforced throughout our lives. And he really believed that our ability to acquire these reflexes for animals, and believed that because we can use words as signals for, objects, we can activate one of these conditioned reflexes, such as salivating from, the mere mention of food. So even in his future studies, he really wanted to kind of explore the behaviorism of people, and how, with his proven studies from animals, how we can take that and we can really do more with it. Probably the Soviet Union at the time wanted to get this kind of conditioned reflexes and, control of human behavior, teaching them to, you know, uh, comply with their communist regimes, and so on as well. Right? And then in the 1920s was the rise of behaviorism. So during the 1920s, behaviorism really emerged as a dominant school, particularly that of psychology in the United States. And Pavlov's work on classical conditioning became a cornerstone of behaviorist theory. And psychologists like John B. Watson and B.S. Skinner um, really were, drew heavily on Pavlov's ideas and used them to develop theories of learning and behavior. And this also, gave Pavlov international recognition and boosted his reputation and solidified his legacy in psychology as we know it today. During World War I was obviously a big world event that occurred during Pavlov's life. This war caused widespread destruction and resource shortages, which affected Pavlov's ability to conduct experiments. And many of his students and colleagues were drafted into the military, which further hindered his research. However, the war also highlighted the importance of scientific research, particularly in physiology and medicine, and Pavlov's work on digestion and reflexes really gained and renewed attention as it had potential applications in treating soldiers with trauma or stress-related conditions as well too. Right, and then another thing that occurred was the Great Depression in 1929. This was a global economic crisis, which affected funding for scientific research worldwide. Pavlov's laboratory faced financial constraints again and made it difficult to procure resources for experiments. And then despite these challenges, Pavlov continued his work demonstrating resilience and dedication to his research, and his ability to persevere during this time really further cemented his status as a leading scientist. Right, and then last but not least, heading towards the end of Pavlov's life was Stalin's regime, actually. And this really impacted Pavlov because under Stalin's rule, scientific research was heavily controlled and often politicized. And Pavlov's work was initially supported by the Soviet government as it aligned with their emphasis on science and progress. However, Pavlov was very, vocal and outspoken. He was critical of the regime's authoritarianism and censorship, and he was very outspoken of the nature and put him at odds with the government, but his, international reputation protected him from severe repercussions had he otherwise not been globally recognized. And this tension between Pavlov and the Soviet regime highlighted the complex relationship between science and politics during this period and how the event shaped Pavlov's theories. And it was also interesting, I think even Pavlov wrote to Stalin himself that he was ashamed to be Russian. And because of how heavily, Stalin's impact was on, developing research in a way that Pavlov approved of. And thankfully, he didn't face repercussions that he would have. And it's just kind of disappointing to hear that we probably would have known more about Pavlov, or we would have, been more accepting of his research and whatnot in the United States had Stalin, not cause, essentially this anti-communist viewpoint that the United States has today. All right, and then today's application of Pavlov's theories today, we can see that there's applications in a couple fields: psychology, marketing, education, neuroscience, and more, but these were just the ones that I really wanted to highlight. So in psychology, classical conditioning, Pavlovian conditioning is used in treating phobias throughout systemic desensitization. So, they're implied in therapies for PTSD by reducing the conditioned fear responses. And even addiction therapy employs aversion therapy and pairing addictive stimuli with negative consequences. I'm taking psychology of addiction right now, and we're kind of learning this. So aversion therapy. If someone is an alcoholic, and then you pair it with negative stimuli, such as every time you drink, you have to take like a pill that makes you throw up, for example, or make you feel nauseous. You're pairing it with negative consequences. So then every time you go for a beer next time, you remember that feeling of throwing up or feeling nauseous, and that's supposed to help with the aversion to addiction, essentially. And that's kind of something based off of the Pavlovian theory. Also, marketing was something very interesting that I saw applications of. So brands often use classical conditioning by associating products typically with positive emotions. So, for example, in like a Coca-Cola commercial or like a soda commercial, using cheerful music and happy scenes to create a positive brand associations. And this can be applied to many things that we see. So usually a common one in marketing that I see recently is like celebrity endorsements. And typically they're, influencers or celebrities that people look up to and have a pretty good association with. So if you see, Martha Stewart promoting this cookware, you're like, oh, okay, I like Martha. I have good associations with her and her cooking. I'm more likely to buy or trust that brand because of her credibility and because of the positive brand associations that I feel when I see Martha advertising this cookware. Also in education, the reinforcement strategies like rewarding students for good behavior are influenced by Pavlov's principles, and educators and teachers apply conditioned learning to create effective classroom management systems as well. And then in neuroscience, some of the modern research examines brain plasticity and how conditioned reflexes affect neural pathways. And some of the studies explore the physiological basis of learning and memory using Pavlovian models. And, Pavlov also believed in this kind of neuroplasticity, and much of our behaviors that are conditioned responses and how we gather in our environments. He also thought that the culture and environments that people grow up in really impacts their learning as well too. And then it's not mentioned on this slides, but I just wanted to throw in there, some of the other fields that Pavlov had influences on was, animal training. So dog training really relies on classical conditioning techniques, as we see. So, repetition and, even if you're trying to teach a dog a new trick, you use a treat and while you're teaching the dog, and then after a while, they won't need the treat anymore to be able to do the trick. And then also healthcare uses Pavlovian conditioning to also reduce patient anxiety before medical procedures as well too. So obviously, Pavlov really did have a big impact in lives today, and learning in behavioral psychology as well in general. Right? And then that is all I have. Thank you so much for listening to me today, and I really hope that you learned something new about Ivan Pavlov. Right? Thank you.